Lawful disclaimer and notice of intent. This podcast and all related content are created, owned, operated, and sponsored exclusively by me, the sole author, speaker, and producer. Any other product, service, and/or entity, living or non-living, which may be discussed, displayed, and/or somehow given attention on this podcast is not and has never been an endorsement, advertisement, support, and/or any other kind of validation for its existence in any capacity, nor at all intended to at all facilitate its continued existence in any capacity. I mention things on what I consider to be an as-needed basis to fulfill what I consider adequate as evidence in my best attempt to prove the reality of who I am and what this podcast is attempting to achieve to clearly demonstrate what I consider to thoroughly substantiate my assertions. I act simultaneously in private and public capacities, and this podcast reflects my direct and autonomous expression. It is created and published from within Canada, but is intended for a global audience, including legal jurisdictions in the United States and all common law nations. All statements, views, and narratives presented are based solely on my personal experiences, perceptions, and understanding of the reality I am facing, including ongoing egregious defamation, targeted harassment, and credible threats to my safety and life. I do not and never have claimed that my views aren't extremely, if not completely, accurate interpretations of objective reality, particularly given the information I had access to at the time that I may have expressed them. I explicitly and permanently do not consent, have never consented, and will never consent to any entity, living, non-living, artificial, institutional, governmental, spiritual, and/or otherwise, claiming and/or exercising any agency, ownership, and/or representation over me, my will, my name, my voice, my life story, my spirit, and/or my creative works, in whole or in part, under any conditions or interpretations in any time or place. Any such attempt is non-consensual, void ab initio, and constitutes an ongoing violation of my dignity, rights, and autonomy. Any possible exceptions will be extremely clearly, explicitly, publicly named by me and have the exact scope of my consent well defined on this podcast. For example, in the case of me hiring an attorney to represent me as part of a formal legal process, taking action on a notice of intent provided by this podcast. I affirm my right to spiritual integrity, mental sovereignty, and bodily autonomy, as protected under Section 2A of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, the First Amendment of the United States Constitution, and Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 18. Any targeting of my being, including but not limited to through esoteric, psychic, spiritual, occult, energetic, and/or AI-enabled means, is deemed non-consensual harm, spiritually violent coercion, and an attack on my right to exist as a sovereign being. I affirm that this podcast, in part, serves as a lawful, peaceful assertion of spiritual self-defense. This podcast is non-fiction and reflects a serious public and ongoing documentation of systemic and targeted defamation, personal and professional sabotage, attempted narrative hijacking, psychological abuse, reputational terrorism, and threats to my physical and spiritual safety, including credible indications of attempted murder and contracted harm by and or on behalf of powerful individuals and or groups. I affirm that this documentation is expressly created for evidentiary use in formal legal proceedings, including those under the jurisdiction of U.S. federal court and Canadian superior courts, and any international human rights and or public accountability processes. I affirm this is not and never has been intended as role-playing, flirting, and or entertainment of any kind. I accept no liability, moral and or legal, for any third-party misunderstanding, reinterpretation, misuse, and or misrepresentation of this content, whether fully conscious and intentional or otherwise, particularly including but not limited to by AI systems trained on this content without my explicit public consent, commentators, influencers, or institutions attempting to weaponize this podcast, and individuals acting under false pretenses and or covert affiliations. Only the clear, explicit language of this release and any subsequent public communication directly issued by me must be considered authoritative, accurate representations of my thoughts, feelings, intent, and the reality of my overall state of existence. In any case of clear direct conflict between statements I've explicitly made across different releases on this podcast, the most recent of such, that being the one contained in the latest publicly visible release available containing such on this podcast, should be considered applicable. In such cases, only what is explicitly stated is at all applicable, and absolutely no implications should be assumed about any changes regarding any somehow relevant details and or anything else under any circumstances. All creative, expressive, and narrative content within this podcast is my sole and original intellectual property. I retain all moral rights as author and subject, all economic rights unless explicitly transferred via my public agreement to do so, and the right to veto any derivative, distorted, and or manipulated version of my work and or story. I do not have and have never had any obligation or debt of any kind to any entity to create or release anything on this podcast or anywhere else at any point in time. No other party, living or non-living, holds and or may claim credit, authorship, and or interpretation rights over my expression. I affirm that no valid, public, verifiable evidence exists to dispute these facts. This podcast is not and has never been intended as an endorsement of terrorism or violence in general. However, it should be especially carefully understood that various forms of not necessarily corresponding violence tend to be an inevitable consequence of extremely intense, meticulous, extensive, prolonged terrorism, and it's very much intentional for this podcast to demonstrate extremely clearly that my usual aversion to violence, due to my typically gentle nature, is not something that has boundless understanding, patience, empathy, or will persist more or less absolutely unconditionally for any reason. I've always wanted and done my very best to ensure it's extremely clear that at all creating, enabling, and or facilitating the perpetuation of narratives at all in contradiction with my official position that is objectively extremely clearly established on this podcast is not, never has been, and never will be what I've been trying to achieve with this podcast or in general in any of my efforts at any point in time. I do not and never have intentionally incited terrorism, including but not limited to violence, blackmail, and or coercion. I affirm my fundamental intent as peaceful, lawful, and self-defensive. However, targeted campaigns to stalk, defame, threaten, impoverish, silence, spiritually attack, and or physically harm me will be treated as conspiracies to commit grievous harm and or murder. This podcast is an affirmative public notice of my unambiguous non-consent and a lawful response to sustained systemic abuse. While my fundamental intent in communicating in general through any means is not and has never been malicious in nature, I affirm it can, will, and should exert malicious influence upon anything operating with malice towards me and or this podcast, especially more so the more demonstrably I'm proving that malice exists. And it should be understood that any situation where I continue not to extremely clearly receive any compensation or reward I'm willing to accept is effectively, absolutely, unconditionally an increase in the severity of that malice. I've created the entirety of this podcast under extremely harsh circumstances that I have always believed and asserted are entirely unjust for me to be left in, given the reality of who I am. Circumstances of my existence, including but not limited to my current housing status, financial vulnerability, and material limitations, do not and cannot invalidate my legal personhood, expressive rights, and or entitlement to protection under law. I reject any attempt to diminish my credibility and or rights on the basis of poverty, social class, and or housing insecurity in accordance with Section 7 of the Canadian Charter, the Due Process Clause of the U.S. Constitution, and international law prohibiting discrimination on the basis of economic status. Despite the extent I've irrefutably exposed the truth surrounding a conflict that should have been so extremely obviously recognized as extremely serious to the point that my efforts on this podcast should have made a substantial difference in my life long ago, my life circumstances continue to not have meaningfully or clearly improved at all whatsoever. I still have not ever received any compensation or reward of any kind whatsoever for any of my efforts at all involving the conflict being addressed by this podcast, neither directly nor indirectly from any source. I am, always have been, and always will be absolutely unconditionally unwilling to ever at all accept any compensation or reward whatsoever, directly or indirectly, that at all compromises my integrity, whether directly or indirectly. I do not, never have, and never will consent to it being at all considered to be me and or any entity operating at all with my consent and or best interests regarding any communication somehow claiming and or implying that I somehow do ever have and or ever will unofficially support any kind of position at all contradictory with what I've said on this podcast. This disclaimer and notice of intent supersedes any and all contrary interpretations, explicitly including any and all unauthorized claims therein made against me. I reserve all legal, expressive, spiritual, moral, and intellectual rights without limitation. Any attempt to silence, reinterpret, discredit, and or co-opt this documentation must be treated as malicious bad faith conduct and may be cited in formal legal proceedings as evidence of further targeting. I saw another instance of what I consider effectively a spiritual assassination attempt shortly after my last release on this podcast. Kimmy started streaming around that time as well. I have several more things to say at this point. First of all, I'm going to address an extremely disturbing murderous energy I saw that was a combination of the murderous white heart emoji energy Arya is publicly officially taking responsibility for attempting to murder me through, as well as a fashion of Chloe and or Celine energy operating simultaneously in what becomes an energy that both puts my life in extreme danger and attempts to drive me crazy mentally and leave me unbelievably exhausted, depleted, and stuck entirely at my expense, to my detriment, against my consent, and clearly knowingly so to everyone involved in exerting such a malicious influence on me. I'm not at all uncertain of what I have to do next in order to progress in life. It's most certainly more than just an inkling. I also don't equate what I see as a spiritual journey through certain tools or mediums to access some kind of spiritual information or insights with the actual journey of living my life. As things are, I haven't been having any gut feelings about relocating or moving. I actually feel more safe where I am than most other places I could probably be, especially considering that homelessness is currently my only real option anywhere I go, and the streets are never really safe no matter where you go. At least where I'm at, I have various resources I know are going to be available to me, with many staff in buildings that know me, and places where I know there are government cameras that I've already reported hitmen literally coming for attempted murders on me, that I imagine at least some government employees are now extra watchful of me because of me reporting how I have. That energy was claiming where I am is creating some type of money blockages for me and trying to push me to relocate or move. I literally haven't been receiving any money, and the only blockages I should have had are intentional because I've been getting egregiously exploited by literal criminals doing scams under my name entirely at my expense against my consent, like I've been publicly explicitly saying countless times already, and I'm absolutely certain by now Chloe, Celine, and Arya must be well aware of, among others. I'm not at the club. I don't go clubbing, ever. Not on the weekend, not on the weekdays. I don't dance in general either. Nobody invites me out. I'm goddamn homeless. I don't have an option on the matter. I'll be out no matter where I go because I don't have any real home to go inside to. Of course, anyone spiritually obligated to protect me is going to have to work overtime with all the hitmen constantly coming after me because nobody goddamn respects me or wants to actually help me, even when I've been crying about this for over a year now on this podcast. I don't go to bars either. I don't have any money to spend or save, so I don't know why that energy is telling me spend less, save more. I've never been thinking of doing any gambling of any kind. All of this should have already been extremely evident. There's literally absolutely zero real evidence to at all prove otherwise. I have no particular inclinations to move to Japan, China, Dubai, or similar areas, not as a vacation nor as moving to more permanently live there. I've already stated extremely clearly that the only place I particularly want to go if I leave Canada is the United States, specifically Los Angeles, specifically because I wish Kimmy wouldn't be subhuman filth so I could actually be with her like I've always wanted. But if that isn't happening, I guess I have no real reason to leave Canada and no particular desire to do so anytime soon. I am not okay financially. I don't have bills paid, although that's because I have no bills. Because again, I'm goddamn homeless. I can't even afford a phone plan. I can't even goddamn afford food. I literally eat out of the garbage to survive, sometimes checking food bank areas, and even then, I often don't feel comfortable taking food if I feel it might be tied to egregious defamation of me that attempts to force fraudulent contracts on me. Apparently, those I once called family are giving pedophile energy and are controlling the narrative of my life in a negative manner. It seems they've been trying to say everything I say is something I've read and not personal experience or something. My eating habits haven't changed. Why am I hearing pushes to be a truck driver? Start a truck driving business? Is this energy on drugs or what? And credit score being significant for Scorpio energy? Is Edison's credit score bad and he's trying to make my life a nightmare to avoid having to face it or something? I do not feel content at any environment you could consider my workplace. I'm at extremely disturbing, perpetual unrest. I don't find words adequate to convey the true extent, depth, and scope of. I don't know why I'm hearing the next 1 to 3 months as if that's supposed to be acceptable as some kind of timeline I have to continue to struggle for as a result of reasons entirely unspecified as far as anything even remotely sane I can see spiritually. Essentially, what I'm seeing spiritually is an energy primarily driven by Chloe, Celine, and Arya is to this day still trying to coerce me to do Grand Theft Auto role-playing and completely derail and deter me from ever actually healing from all my past traumas in life. Also trying to get me to be unsafe at night so I'm more prone to getting murdered. Lying egregiously that I'm a party type going out to bars and clubs and drinking. I want this to be extremely clear. I don't and will never accept any kind of apology from Chloe. I don't accept any peace offering from Chloe. She started a war to the literal death against me, and that's what she's going to get. If it's me or her that's going to die over what she's done, it's going to be her, and I'll make absolutely certain of that. I will be pursuing her getting all of her extremely negative karma that she deserves for the attempted murder of me that she's been trying to achieve with extensive help from Mary, Celine, Kristen, and Monica, among others, where Jamie, Lena, and Elaine have been trying to only exacerbate the pain and suffering and difficulty I have to overcome to even just stay alive every day in extremely brutal, life-threatening deprivation that's increasingly, irrefutably, obviously completely undeserved by me and obviously extremely clearly unwanted by me. Chloe definitely knows I'm struggling extremely badly financially, but spiritually, it's abundantly evident to me that anything and everything she might ever be saying, particularly in relation to giving me any kind of financial opportunities, is an extremely egregious setup to trap me in the murderous energy she has going on with her and Celine, Jamie, Lily, and Arya that is trying to completely strip me of any safety and also any spiritual protection, and is trying to simultaneously force me into having to work even harder and even in contexts where I don't even have the tools or resources or time or energy to do so, and she's well aware of that, but still wants to impose on me in a manner that would literally drive me insane and lead to my death very quickly if I were to ever embrace that energy. Chloe is currently trying to figure out how to make money without paying fees, and I'm not exactly sure if that's literally physical fees of actual money and or some kind of spiritual fees, as in the amount of effort she'd have to put in to bring that money to her, but it seems to me that her latest efforts to trap me have to do with egregiously lying that she's actually been giving me financial opportunities, and I'm just complaining because the fees of those opportunities that she's lying she's giving me are supposedly too high. It seems Fuslie and Saikuno are extremely heavily involved in specifically conspiring to murder me through egregious defamation of me being enabled and facilitated through Grand Theft Auto role-playing. I'm hearing all kinds of names of people I've never heard of before being involved. Blair, Penny, Chapman, Piper, Taylor, Sandy, Lucille, McGee, Ethel, Truong, Dylan, Janice, and the name Addison came up again. It seems that murderous white heart emoji energy that Chloe's been trying to channel through Jamie, Lily, and Arya to have me murdered for her selfish gain has backfired so hard and cascaded so deeply down through the Jamie, Lena, and Maine energy that apparently multiple places including Paris, Italy, and France are in chaos over an emoji. That energy causing that also seems to be trying to body shame me and expects me to stay silent about it because I don't have the body of a supermodel. As for Kimmy's latest stream, I don't know why Kimmy suddenly brought particular attention to strawberries, and it's not something I wanted, needed, and or benefited from at all. There were strawberries on her cup and on her lighter, although I don't know or particularly care what that's supposed to mean. Also, this isn't the first time she's strangely been gulping with the microphone at her throat, and that's not something I understand or at all wanted, needed, and or benefit from at all either. I did not particularly enjoy Kimmy's curly hair, and I suspect egregious false narratives are trying to exploit what I said about Jessica preferring curly hair in order to attempt to aggravate me with Kimmy's behavior in order to do what is most likely furthering goals extremely malicious against me, occurring entirely to my detriment against my consent by Emaine, Jamie, and Lena. I found it strange that Kimmy said her microphones were so crispy on her latest stream because I honestly didn't notice any difference. I'm not sure what Joelle's influence trying to ruin my life being particularly crispy might mean either. Perhaps it's an extremely devious way Kimmy essentially tries to flaunt being especially malicious and cruel towards me. I don't know, but it makes me angry to even just think about it. I also found it strange that Kimmy felt compelled to briefly do some kind of fast and or loud and or aggressive ASMR. That's obviously not the kind of ASMR she typically does or seems to particularly enjoy. She most certainly didn't do it for me, since I've never requested it and don't have any particular inclinations to it, and absolutely nobody has ever had any even remotely actually adequate reason to believe otherwise. I've now seen her practically try to force herself to do such ASMR, despite even herself explicitly recognizing it's not her style or her preference, which I've been finding increasingly strange and compelled to make sure it's clear is not something I personally at all benefit from. I don't know what Kimmy putting a Labubu in jail in that thing she put it in is supposed to mean either. I also don't know what that's supposed to have in relation to Kimmy's ring finger still being injured, although it's got to mean something in relation to her marital status, I assume. Perhaps me exposing so many things is exposing Edison for having criminally exploited and harmed me entirely to my detriment against my consent, and trying to manipulate Kimmy in ever having gotten married to her. It's increasingly incriminating that Kimmy's increasingly blatantly demonstrating that she effectively actively censors her Twitch chat and discourages actual thinking when she streams. She was just trying to encourage crashing out, but it's blatantly mentally ill, unhinged crashing out if she's trying to do that in a context where thinking is blatantly discouraged, and even in fact, she intentionally tries to suppress it and unapologetically punishes it. She's effectively also exposing herself for egregiously defamatory misrepresentation of what she's been putting me through, as if attempts to block me from thinking about things is somehow satisfying, as if I owe her something for actively suppressing and sabotaging my life in an extremely detrimental manner to an egregiously damaging extent for so long, and still to this day showing absolutely no even remotely adequate, if at all, actual desire and or willingness to engage with me at all properly and healthily how I want and deserve. It doesn't matter how loud Kimmy's content is. It's only even more damaging to me if Kimmy tries to act like the volume of her audio and or the tone of her voice or something like that is somehow magically negating the extreme harm that her attitude and behavior towards me is actively ongoing, inflicting on me entirely regardless. Even more incriminating, Kimmy explicitly admits that she expects nothing less from Big Skanger and his Grand Theft Auto role-playing character Zakid, that they're causing trouble. I've been hearing spiritually that he's been constantly gossiping and talking smack about me behind the scenes. I find it quite difficult to believe Kimmy didn't know that kind of situation would be occurring before she ever chose to engage in her September character dating his role-playing character Zakid. So the incriminating evidence is only piling up that Kimmy unapologetically had a good time, in her own words, making my life a living hell, my worst nightmare of nightmares, and actively unapologetically putting my life in extreme danger with hitmen coming after me regularly, entirely at my expense, against my consent, for her own extremely selfish gain. I'm getting only increasingly aggravated that Kimmy only continues to seem to grow closer to Jamie instead of me the more I expose Jamie for not only being a massive fraud, but also increasingly unapologetically, maliciously, actively, ongoingly sabotaging and suppressing me, and refusing to at all even remotely adequately acknowledge her involvement in the literally extremely life-threatening deprivation that I currently am facing because of her and Kimmy. These criminals belong in prison if they're going to keep behaving like this. Seriously. Or worse. I found it especially suspicious how Kimmy suddenly decided to go into the just chatting section instead of the ASMR section on Twitch literally right after I commented on her ad revenue in the ASMR section, as if she needed my validation to do so or something. And then it seems like she's unapologetically attempting to deny that and or exploit my objectively level-headed and fair position on the matter in order to attempt to egregiously misrepresent me as having owed it to her somehow to say what I said about it and likely validate false narratives about me that she knows are false in order to continue to suppress and sabotage me entirely at my expense against my consent. I don't buy it that Kimmy thinks Mediterranean food is particularly good. This whole time I've followed her all these years, she's shown a clear preference for Korean food above others, and if anything, probably also Japanese and Chinese food, maybe Mexican and American food in general. I myself largely resonated with those preferences I've seen of hers, and I've never had any particular inclinations towards Mediterranean food myself. It seems the criminal subhuman filth that have been trying to suppress and sabotage me for so long have more recently been attempting to egregiously misrepresent me as otherwise and trying to force Kimmy to say and do things that their lying give her and or others leverage over me, particularly in relation to food. I find it even more egregiously inappropriate that Kimmy randomly decided to bring up pegging practically out of nowhere and then tied that to being a grounding presence. It's like she's trying to imply that anyone ever had any even remotely adequate reason to believe my pursuit of her ever was intended to make any implications about me wanting to be pegged, and even trying to act like somehow her clearly extremely selfish desire to go along with such narratives was somehow intended to be some kind of positive grounding presence. I have never and do not want to get pegged, and since it's probably part of the egregious misrepresentation of me to suggest otherwise, I should also mention that my gender identity as female also is not and has never been at all intended to indicate anything different, nor has anything I've ever said or done been even remotely adequate reason to believe otherwise. Also, I do not and have never had any fixation of being called a good boy or a good girl or a bad boy or a bad girl or something like that, nor has anyone ever had any even remotely adequate reason to believe otherwise. Despite how Kimmy's basically single-handedly ensured her extremely abusive, disrespectful, and neglectful attitude towards me has been the by far largest contributor to me being ostracized from society and feeling like literally the entire world is against me, Kimmy still has the audacity to go live on stream and talk about we're all in this together, as if it's beyond the realm of even being fathomable that she'd actually be such a malicious force in my life as I've been saying. Even despite all the irrefutable evidence, even despite me saying the exact same kinds of things literally for the last several years, I continue to face hitmen coming after me constantly, and Kimmy gets to laugh and talk about what goddamn candles she's going to make next, like this is all one huge joke to her. If we take another look at something Kimmy did in her prior stream, Kimmy joked that Juniper would be taking all her audience's money. So, if we go by the idea that Juniper somehow represents Kimmy's connection with Big Skanger and or Zakid, then Kimmy becomes blatantly flaunting that her plan was to have him steal all my money that should be coming in for me all along, increasingly incriminating evidence that she's been trying to entrap me in a plot to completely steal everything from me and then absolutely devastate, destroy, and literally end my life in real life through unbelievably egregious abuse of literally every possible aspect of my existence she could possibly exploit through the feelings for her she must know have always been completely sincere, while she's been fully consciously and intentionally, utmost maliciously, knowingly harming me by acting like our fake. Although at this point, dealing with even Kimmy and Jamie is really just starting to feel like having to expose the pathetic and blatantly egregiously criminal politics of subhuman filth who probably deserve to be murdered for what they've done to me, among several others, including many from my past, on perhaps a lighter note of someone who doesn't seem to me like they literally deserve death for being absolutely irredeemable subhuman filth scum of the earth, I recently came across a YouTuber called Nuxanor and watched one of his recent videos. I don't even want to bring myself to watch Hassan Hamas Diddy Piker's Twitch streams directly, but I suppose this Nuxanor guy approaching 900,000 subscribers on YouTube probably isn't egregiously misrepresenting things right out the gate within the first 3 minutes that he's starting that video. I believe that's a reasonable assumption for me to make. I watched the whole video, and this guy says Hassan Diddy Bin Laden Piker. I guess he has multiple nicknames, none of them anything I'd be proud of. Clearly, the consensus is he's a terrorist supporter and probably involved in pedophilia to a non-trivial extent. And yet I'm a weirdo to him, despite that I don't support terrorists or pedophilia, and I never have and can't imagine I ever will. And he gets among the top viewership on Twitch, while I face hitmen coming after me frequently for doing nothing wrong and actually being a genuinely good person, and I struggle to get even 10 views on my videos that clearly actively oppose both terrorism and pedophilia. Both things there's absolutely zero real evidence to suggest I actually support or ever have supported. Well then, see, I've really always wanted to avoid getting into politics, and I've really wanted to make that a point since Kimmy and others seem to have been trying extremely hard for a very long time to extremely egregiously misrepresent my efforts as some disingenuous, scummy thing that has some kind of political agenda behind it. But I didn't know Iran is a terrorist state that chants death to America. If what Nuxanor is saying is true, then I actually do have a position on Iran, and it's that I officially don't like or support their leadership, on the basis of my fundamental principles of, not supporting terrorism. Like, if I had to pick between America or Iran, I most certainly would rather live in America. I mean, it's not something I'm exactly thrilled about, but Canada is basically a cucked America. So I guess you could say I already do live in America in a sense, and it's part of what's called North America after all anyways. I've never had any strange foreign interests, and it's only making more sense to me now why I felt so endangered while in John's presence. A guy from Iran, in case that wasn't clear, that I felt I had to firmly, unwaveringly cut out of my life completely within only a couple months because my political position supportive of Canada and the United States over all other countries was one I've only been reinforcing all along. I guess the only potential issue I run into if I go deeper into politics becomes that supporting the United States might become like a proxy support for Israel, particularly more than I'd intended, since from what I've gathered in very brief research, it seems the US government sort of likes to suck up to Israel for money. I really don't know what Israel's politics are, and I most certainly don't feel I've been given any money and or other incentive to dive into dealing with whatever issues Israel might have with other countries due to what I imagine would be historical conflicts between them. I support Canada and the United States of America because I live in Canada and I rely on the Canadian and US law, like the Constitution, in order to basically be able to stay alive and have any real even potential to ever really thrive after all the egregious defamation and framing and crimes committed against me in this conspiracy to murder me and attempts therein that I insist are entirely undeserved by me. While I support the foundation of sovereign lawful operation, I have no particular desire or interest in sucking up to Israel myself. Of course, if Iran wants nukes to bomb Canada and or the US and effectively threatens the safety and life of me and people I'm inclined to potentially care about like Kinney, then that's reason enough for me to have an issue with Iran. Israel doesn't particularly seem to want to harm me or Kimmy, so I'm more inclined to be neutral towards them on principle. I don't appreciate Cucksthony's what I assume is sarcasm in calling Israel cucked and Iran giga-chad gods, although I guess I would have to respect that I can see why he'd be framed as something of a political mastermind. How he positioned himself to bring exposure to me, to try to suppress me, sabotage my reputation, and be enabled and facilitated by Offline TV and their friends and other associates to make me seem like a massive fraud, while he can't even adequately hold a political position on trans people in sports decent enough not to get him permanently banned off Twitch, is quite something. Gotta give him that. I've never even really cared about sports, and most certainly have never wanted to get involved in professional sports personally. Yet, just because I, use my brain to critically think, my take on it is better than his, but I'm the one that ended up banned from Twitch because Kimmy felt like bullying me, lying to me, hiding things from me, and shifting blame for her mental illness onto me. Destiny's actual serious political positioning got him banned off a platform that openly platforms and defends literal terrorism supporters and just generally extremely scummy, murderous, psychopath, massive frauds, and yet he managed to get banned with such a large following and long historical reputation with live streaming as I continued to defend myself and survive hitmen that is gross neglect to both handle giving me proper exposure and deal with all of Offline TV even remotely sanely, ultimately directly, extremely heavily caused. Look, what I know is I'm pretty sure I literally stopped Iran from getting nukes. They were trying to exploit me egregiously through John, Dixon, and Mary, especially in order to attempt to get entirely at my expense against my consent. I didn't choose to be born into a family where Mary and that entire side of that family came from Iran. If Dixon hadn't been so extremely egregiously disrespectful and neglectful towards me, I never would have even reached a point of feeling so genuinely afraid for my safety and life that I ever thought reaching out to John might even possibly have been a good idea. I really don't think my takes on all the higher level politics are even crazy, and none of the subhuman filth I keep exposing for being terrible ex-family have any really defensible positions or adequate evidence to keep trying to sacrifice me to feed Dixon's extremely criminal life insurance fraud he did to me, fully consciously and intentionally, entirely at my expense against my consent. Also,
I have no intentions of seeking a psychological evaluation or getting any kind of mental illness diagnosis anytime soon. I don't believe myself to have ADHD, bipolar, depression, borderline personality disorder, or anything else to any extent that it'd be an accurately diagnosable mental illness. I experience gender dysphoria, but even so, I don't have any plans to go on hormone replacement therapy for any time soon because I believe I could still express myself femininely how I'd like if I even just had less extremely deprived life circumstances.